So I began therapy about 3 months ago, because, like most of you, I have a lot going on. While things were going okay, I really wasn't feeling like we were making any progress, until my therapist prescribed me a journal. I started writing down my thoughts and feelings throughout the day, trying to create some sort of roadmap out of depression, I guess. On top of that, she asked me if there were any creative outlets I enjoyed where I could express myself. Express things I haven't spoken about yet. I said writing. I was always interested in reading novels and writing things when I was younger. Maybe I felt like I had stuff I wanted to escape from, or maybe I just sucked at sports. Regardless, at some point I stopped writing. I stopped for a long time. So, to make up for lost time, I felt like it was the perfect opportunity to write about something that changed my life when I was 14 years old. I'm sharing this after my therapist read it. She said it was an interesting fictionalization of the events that occurred to me, and how a falling out with my parents can seem otherworldly through the lens of childhood innocence, or something like that. It sort of pissed me off when she said that. Maybe because I was worried she was right, and that's why I never told anyone what happened. Worried they'd discredit me, invalidate me, laugh it off and say I was just a kid grasping at straws to cope. But they're wrong. I know what happened, and I know that it was real. After reading this, I hope some of you think so too. My name is Andrew. It was 2004, and I was freshly 14 as of July. I remember it all starting on a Friday near the end of August. I came home from a friend's house in the early afternoon, and the TV was on. The Greece Summer Olympics were playing, but nobody was around to watch it. For a moment, I thought it may have been my older brother, Sam. Another second, and I remembered that he had moved to the other side of Willamette the day after my birthday. That's Portland, for anyone who's wondering. A really thoughtful gift, I'd say. That meant it had to be my dad that left the TV on. My mom had been out of the picture for a couple of years at that point. She moved to Maine, and we'd sent letters back and forth. I guess she was trying to cut herself off from technology, since I never heard from her over the phone, but maybe she was just trying to cut herself off from our family. Either way, it was just me and my dad left in our modest house in the woods. We lived about a 40-minute bike ride from the main road in town, out near the river park. I never had much reason to go into town aside from school, shopping with my dad, and visiting my one friend who lived behind the movie theater. My dad, Harry, was an ecological surveyor. I never really asked what that meant, but I know he spent a lot of time out in the woods or in his office when he wasn't away at conferences. Yet he always managed to find time to go hiking or foraging in spite of this, and never asked me to come along either. In fact, that's probably where he was, instead of watching the Olympics. I rarely knew where he was or what he was doing. The only time we spent time together was in the morning at breakfast. I always ate dinner alone. After a week of near silence and passing remarks with my dad, I decided to make an attempt at actual conversation. While washing the dishes after breakfast, I asked my dad what he's been working on lately, since he seemed busier than usual. It's odd. It felt like I could hear his ears perk up before he even spoke. Actually, I've been meaning to show you what I've been working on. It's really exciting stuff, buddy. That got my attention. I set down the wet pot in the dish rack before walking towards the table and glancing over his shoulder. He had some mushrooms spread out on some sterile-looking fabric and a large, opened encyclopedia off the side. I think I've discovered a new type of fungi. There doesn't seem to be any matching descriptions here. His finger waved across the pages of illustrations and text. See, I thought it could be this here. Lacaria amethystina, the amethyst deceiver. But you can tell by the shape and color it's just too sharp and red. Its gills are too pocketed to be the Hortibolitus robellus, and even though it's shiny like a Jubilee wax cap, the stalk is just all wrong. He kept talking about the different varieties of shrooms, and I noticed the apple-sized specimen lying out on the table. I gently grasped its head and lay it out on my hand. Its cap was a gradient of deep violet and cobalt blue. The trim around the edges was gaunt, like it was made of sharp bone. The deep magenta gills underneath converged in a white stalk that deepened in color towards the bottom. I thought it was black at first, but turning it in my palm under the light revealed a deep burgundy, almost like aged blood. You know, mushrooms are connected to each other via a network of something called mycelium. It's usually underground, so we can't see it, yet it can sometimes expand across an entire forest, or even further. It's said that it acts almost like a nervous system. It's almost like the mushrooms have a psychic connection with one another. My dad stopped rambling for a moment, turning to notice the mushroom in my hand. His eyes widened. "You shouldn't touch that," he yelped as he immediately snatched it, pinching me in the process. He turned away from me, coddling the fungus before prodding it, examining it for any damages. I still don't know that much about it, Andy. You have to be more careful." He scolded me without looking back in my direction. I didn't respond as I rubbed out the red marks on my hand. He spoke again, more fatherly now, as he put down his glasses and the mushroom, finally looking me in the eyes. "I'm sorry, buddy. This is really important, and it could be dangerous. I've been trying to handle it with gloves or cloth when possible. Fungi can sometimes be covered, and—" "It's fine, Dad. It didn't hurt that much," I muttered. The mark of his fingernails were gone at that point. "Okay," he said, unmoved. "Well, then, I think I might just spend the rest of the evening in my office. Lots of work to do." He gathered everything up in the bundle of cloth, as if he were running away from home, and then shut himself in his office. It was rare for him to close that dark oak door, except when he and Mom would fight, or when he'd have a drink, or 5. The rest of the night went by quietly. I tucked myself away in my room, reading and listening to music like usual. It had been a couple of hours since the sun went down, and the air from my open window just started to cool down. The sweet smell of late summer carried in on the breeze. My attention was drawn to my bedroom door at the sound of a knocking. It creaked open, and the first thing I saw were the thick-rimmed glasses my dad wore whenever he was trying to be productive. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, as if he were unsure of how much he'd regret his next sentence. I pulled down my headphones to be polite. "Would you—" He gulped one more time. "Would you want to come foraging with me tomorrow? I know we haven't gone together since— well, it's been a while." It always bugged me how afraid he was to mention Mom in any capacity, even after 2 years. As if she was listening to what he'd say, or that I'd burst into tears at the mere mention of her. He vowed to stop drinking the day before she left, and he's kept to it. I guess he just feels guilty about it all, but maybe he shouldn't. Yeah, that sounds good, Dad. Do I have to be up early?" I was actually eager to hear what he'd say. He was finally making an attempt. Yes, but I'll make sure that you're up. No worries there. I'll see you bright and early then." "Yeah, sure thing, Dad." He quietly pulled the door back into place. A small grin appeared at the corner of his mouth. I remember the exchange so vividly. It was the first time in years that I went to bed excited for the next day. I slept like a baby. The next morning, I was awake before my dad sounded his 3 raps on my door. We sat down for a quick breakfast as he told me where we'd be going. It wasn't actually that far, maybe about a 30-minute walk into the river park that sprawled near our house. I was still pretty excited. I remember it being really hot, the hottest day of August by far. Almost like it was summer's last hurrah before fall quietly took its place. I was sweating within a few minutes of our hike into the woods. My dad walked in front of me, pretty quiet the whole time. He kept looking around and glancing over his shoulder as if he were worried about becoming some toothy thing's lunch. Just as I started imagining what kind of rabid animal would most likely devour us, my dad's steps shortens, and he came to a complete standstill. He waited for a moment and carefully scanned around one more time, then directed his gaze at me and paused. He was considering something. "Say, how about I show you where I found that mushroom? You can't tell anyone where it is, since I don't want to disrupt the biome." I said yes without much thought as we splintered off from the worn path. It wasn't until then that I started to realize how important this discovery could be to my dad. Maybe his paranoia was somewhat justified. We ended up walking longer than my dad's initial estimate of 30 minutes, but it might have been because he hadn't decided whether he'd show me his discovery or not. The sun was beating down hard, and the insects seemed to love the heat. They were practically screeching in ecstasy. "Hey, Dad, are we almost there?" I was practically panting. "Almost." "How'd you even find this place? Work?" He didn't answer right away. "Yeah, you could say that." He was being odd, but I didn't want to mess up our first outing in years. So we continued walking in the blistering heat in silence. I spent the rest of the time daydreaming about having an ice-cold soda with lunch once we got back. Thankfully, the green canopy above shielded us from most of the harsh rays the deeper we got. I watched the patterns of light, broken up on the ground, as I followed my dad's heels. The roots became more and more exposed as we went. It took most of my attention to not trip over them as we seemed to tiptoe on the dirt packed between them. Why'd you—" I snapped as I bumped into my dad's solid back. He'd stopped again. It took a few seconds, but my nose was soon filled with something I'd never quite smelled before. It was thick and sticky, hot and a little bit sweet, almost like the smell of rotting flowers. I peeked around my dad's khaki-clad body and became curious. The canopy was thicker here, barely allowing any light to break through and reach the forest floor. A small grove covered in thick moss lay before us, light skittering across the surface with each gust of wind. Yet the thing I noticed first was what sat in the middle. Several small bulbs, nearly identical to the one I held in my palm the night before. My dad still hadn't moved, but the scene drew me in. I carefully encroached into the nest of flora, inhaling more of the powerful aroma. It became more sickly and rancid the closer I got. A couple more feet, I had instinctively grasped my nose and squeezed, plugging it shut. Nestled in the moss was a dead body. It looked like a doe, but some of her skin and fur seemingly had melted off in her journey to the other side. The decay was most evident in her face. Her gums had rotted away, revealing far too many teeth for an herbivore. Her eyes had dried out and were covered in flies. Dried blood dripped from several points on her belly, dark and cracked, like a river that had run dry years ago. If I had to guess now, the blood was the result of a hunter's buckshot. Back then it looked as though some giant bird had sunk its talons into the poor animal's gut several times over. To my amazement, I could even count each point of entry. I could count them because in each spot, encrusted in deep, dark blood, had a very clear marker protruding from it. A mushroom. My dad finally approached from behind me, piping up like a teacher at school. Mushrooms, they normally feed on organic life and decaying material. Much like certain insects or scavenging animals, they're drawn to things that are decomposing. My dad kept rubbing the sweat off his face, hovering his fingers over his lips as if he were attempting to block the stench from entering his nose and mouth. Though this kind of growth is very unusual for a fungus. They don't normally grow on, well, bodies. His awkward explanation didn't ease the growing nausea I felt in my stomach as he nonchalantly stepped near the cadaver and slipped his finger into the rotting, gory wound, sliding out the intact fungi and rolling it out across his palm. My excitement from earlier, much like my appetite for lunch, began to fade the more engrossed my father became in that putrid plant. One after another, I watched his glistening red fingers slip inside of the poor animal. He treated them with such care, lying them out on a white rag he'd just pulled out. The smell was overwhelming, so I kept my distance. But among the chirping of bugs, I could hear my dad muttering to himself. It almost sounded like baby talk, as if he was speaking to a dog or a newborn. As I walked around the perimeter, I kept catching my foot in the moss. Some of it would lift up with ease, and so I sort of kicked it around, eventually revealing the soft soil underneath. "Hey, Andrew!" I stopped in my tracks to look at my dad. He was staring daggers at me. "I didn't bring you here to mess around. You're interfering with the ecosystem. Now stop that." My dad had never yelled at me like that before. Or, at least, not in a long time. He was really angry with me. But I didn't really have time to react to his outburst. I was too stunned by what I saw when he was looking at me. His face dripped with sweat, from his forehead to his brow, shiny and wet above his lips. I had to blink a few times, hoping I was just hallucinating due to the heat. But it was still there. Mixed in with the sweat was blood. It was smeared around his mouth and nose, with a few spots on his forehead. I couldn't believe he was so careless, so much so I thought it might have been intentional. The thought made me heave a little. I was surprised I didn't vomit right then. I wasn't daydreaming about lunch anymore. In fact, I didn't eat again that day. When he seemed to be done gathering the mushrooms, he sauntered over to me. He wiped the blood off his face with a different rag, though I think he was most likely trying to remove the buildup of sweat. Should we bury her, Dad?" I asked, cautiously, fearful of another intense reaction. It felt wrong to leave something dead out in the open. I've had to bury a couple pets in the past. I know this wasn't the same, but it sure felt close enough. "No," he exclaimed, wide-eyed, as though I just said something crazy. No, it would be best to leave her here." "But isn't that wrong? I know she's just a deer, but I don't know. Isn't it like a respect thing?" He put his hands on his hips and looked down for a moment, before gazing up at the sun between the trees. "Andrew, you're not wrong. If it..." He sighed, and he raised his shoulders in a shrug. "If it were your mom or grandma, I'd bury her. Trust me. But it's a deer. And right now, it's the only spot where this new species seems to be growing. I don't want to adjust anything. We still don't know every environmental factor that comes into play." He was squinting up at the trees still, then looked down at me. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "Okay. Well, let's head home then. I'm drenched." We didn't speak the rest of the way home. I still had no idea what to say. Something about the whole day felt so wrong to me. I don't know how to describe it other than inhuman. I wish I could say that this was the end of it, but it was only going to get so much worse. It had been a week since our trip into the woods before my dad said much of anything to me. I think it's become pretty clear I had no interest in his work anymore, and that was all he had time for. He became consumed by his research, couldn't be bothered to cook a meal anymore. The only thing he had time for was tea. He'd brew 4 to 5 mugs of it in a day, and I'd stave off hunger with whatever canned soup I could find in our pantry. As I was trying to put together dinner one night, the door to my dad's study swung open. His eyes were wide, and they locked on to me. Then he sheepishly looked away, walked past me, and muttered something about taking a walk. He moved into the hallway, and I heard the front door shut behind him. I hadn't seen him all day, and the best he could muster was word salad. I glanced at the deep oak barrier that had been separating us all week, yet something was different about it now. The office door was open. I found myself staring at the large gap. The room was finally vacant, and I had a chance to see what sort of research had been conducted. I worried a little about what he'd do if he'd caught me. However, I needed to see what was more important than feeding his own son. The room looked relatively normal, just as I remembered it, albeit a bit messier than before. The only glaring difference being the horrible number of corpse shrooms that littered his desk. Some were separated, cut into cross-sections and seemingly put on display in various apparatuses. Others were sliced thin, laying in clear solutions or between panes of glass next to his microscope. I picked up an intact mushroom and examined it more closely than last time, turning it around in my hand and gently manipulating its components and folds. The edge of it was interesting, extremely durable, yet plastic, like cartilage. It could bend and twist before snapping back into shape. Its flesh was soft and would spring back like a well-baked cake. Pressing down a bit harder would create interesting effect. My thumb would leave behind a lighter blue mark, and after some time the color would deepen back to its original state. Almost like when you press down on your fingernail. A sharp sting shot through my finger as I grazed the slip between the gills. A singular drop of blood, as if from a pinprick, sat on the tip of my finger and swelled into a red balloon. I examined the underside of the mushroom more carefully, bringing it close to my eye. Hooks, or teeth of some sort, sporadically lined the inside of the gills, all pointing in the same inward direction, as if the cap could close itself towards the stalk, trapping some kind of prey and pulling it in deeper. I heard a thump. Before I knew it, the mushroom was on the floor. I dropped it. More accurately, I think I might have tossed it. I swore that as it rested in my palm, it throbbed, almost like I was holding a beating heart. The shock of it made me flinch. Son. I froze. I didn't hear him come in. You should be more careful, he said, without any strong emotion. I told you not to touch that with your bare hands. I turned around, not sure if I should be embarrassed or terrified. Dad, I didn't mean to drop it. It just, I don't know. It moved in my hand or something, like it was alive. He stared at me, blinking a few times, though it didn't really look like he was trying to process what I just said. I found that the mushroom cap is coated in some sort of mild neurotoxin. He walked across the room to grab a rag. It's something in the natural oils. It could make your hand feel strange, I suppose. He bent over, draping the rag over the mushroom before picking it up. I'm sorry for not warning you, but the good news is they're harmless if you rinse the stuff off. I rubbed my index finger to my thumb to see if I could feel it, but all I could focus on was the blood I was smearing around. My dad continued to look at me blankly, not breaking eye contact as he drank more of his tea. I tried some, actually, he admitted, a bit of hesitation. It turns out the cap brews a decent mushroom tea. After you wash off the oils, of course. Completely harmless. No symptoms of psilocybin. Nutty aftertaste. I expected him to smirk at his own joke like he used to, but he didn't. He was so deadpan, I'm not even sure that he was joking at all. I could feel my hand tremble. The finger had gone numb. I placed my bloodied hand in my other palm, trying to massage the feeling back into my finger. As I did, blood kept blooming from the fingertip, and I could smell iron wafting up. As I looked back up, I was almost shocked to see that my dad was reactionless. He didn't even ask what happens to my finger. Instead, just looking at me with an intense stare. It dawned on me as I stared back at my dad's face. I had nobody I could talk to about this. I'd just be worried they'd think I'm crazy, or worse, if my dad found out I told someone about the mushrooms, actually, I wasn't sure what he'd do. What he would be willing to do. The intrusive, lonely thoughts wouldn't stop coming. I felt my face twisting up in distress. My dad must have noticed, and he did something stranger than anything else in the past few weeks. More than the crazy mushroom or his distant behavior. He slowly approached and tried to comfort me. Hey there, buddy. You don't have to be upset. I'm not mad at you. I looked up at him and saw some remnants of my father from when I was younger. Someone who didn't drink and actually seems to give a damn. How about I make us some dinner? Sound good? I nodded. It did actually sound good. I was getting sick of canned soup. Things seemed slightly better for the next couple weeks. My mom finally returned my last letter. It had taken longer than normal, but I figured she was just busy. I was just happy to finally hear back. I was also surprised at how much it smelled like her. Her perfume soaked into the stationery. I remember the day I told my dad how much I missed her, how he provided me with the address to her house I'd never visited. The stamp on the corner was neatly placed. It must have been pretty new since I hadn't seen it before. A reddish-orange sunset was blocked out by blue coniferous trees. In front, an ocean wave smashing against a rock. Sweetheart, I'm sorry you've been feeling so alone lately. I'm sending you a big hug. Maybe you should try calling Sam again. I know you were never the best of friends, but I remember you two spending all of your time together. Even if it was arguing, how you'd fight about which songs to play during our long drives to visit Grandma down south, whether reading a novel was better than playing basketball. You two definitely kept things interesting for your dad and I. I'm also sorry that it took so long to write you back. I've been so busy with work these days. I barely find time to eat or do my laundry. It's good to know that your father has kept himself busy with his work too, but it sounds like it's been hard on you. Try to understand that whatever it is, it must be important. Keep doing your best, honey. Love, always. Mom. That's an understatement. My dad was unhealthily obsessed with his work, but he was at least making it to dinner more often. Apparently, he read that chili was really easy to make in bulk, so we could just reheat it and eat together. So we did. Every night. I swear, by the 5th day I was already getting sick of it. After the 12th, I didn't think I could ever eat chili again. It's just chunks of meat and who knows what else in the bowl. But my dad was trying, at least. so I did my best to choke it down night after night. Eventually, it was just too much. I think it even started giving me headaches. "Hey, Dad?" I broke the silence as I stirred the red, mysterious meat around. "Yes, Andy." Do you think we could, I don't know, eat something else for a change?" "You don't like chili?" "Well, the chili's good. I mean, was good the first few times, but I guess I'm kind of getting sick of it." He stopped eating in the middle of a bite. The spoon hovered in front of his mouth for a moment, before slowly lowering back into his bowl. "I didn't realize I raised 2 ungrateful sons." Dad?" "What? I finally put effort into making dinner for you, and you act like it's nothing? And you think it was easy? Saving up for Sam's tuition for years, just for him to drop out 2 days in, all to live with some sluts in Portland and work at a video store? Makes me sick." "Sam said he just wanted to take a gap year. I don't think—" "Don't get me started on that again. He's just a lazy, ungrateful loser." He shook his head. "Makes me cringe to think you could turn out like him. Must have spent too much time with your mother." He still wasn't looking at me. "What? Dad, stop, okay? You're just stressed. You've been working too much lately." I paused before deciding if what I was about to accuse him of would be worth it. "Dad, have you been drinking again?" I could see his fingers tighten around the spoon, seemingly ready to brandish it as a weapon. "What did you say? Do I look like I have time to waste on drinking? Don't you know how busy I am? How much important work I still have to do? I'm just worried that you know what I want, what I would really love right now. I would love to be working, but instead I'm trying to spend time with you, my son. Then you choose to act like this." He finally stood up at me. His gaze was so hot that I had to avoid it. I dropped my eyes to the bowl in front of me as he continued. "Spoiled brat." "I didn't mean to—" His chair scraped the floor as he stood up, bowl in hand. "You know what, Andrew? Maybe I'm just getting sick of you, just like your mother did. Thank God for that. What an insensitive whore. I can't believe I was married to someone who would abandon her children." His eyes were burning into the crown of my skull, forcing boiling hot tears out of my eyes. His words set me on fire. "Finish your dinner. I'm going to eat in my office." Without turning my head, I watched him walk away and slam that wooden barrier behind him. My face was burning and wet. I was on my own again. Another few days passed like this. I never saw my dad during the daylight hours, even when I was home from school on the weekends. My only friend was away on a late vacation, left on the last day of August, and was supposed to be back by the end of September. Still a week left. My brother always said he was too busy to talk on the phone or visit, even though he was only an hour away. Even my mom could barely send a reply to my letters anymore. Maybe my dad was right. Maybe everyone was just getting sick of me. I'd lay awake in bed at night, staring at the ceiling and think back to our fight, wondering what I did wrong, why I was such a screw-up, what the point of it all was. I fell asleep to those thoughts often. They whispered to me like a sick lullaby, and I did my best to shut them out and talk myself down. Yet these horrible, intrusive thoughts continued to invade my mind. Sometimes, all I could do was put on my headphones, focus on the lyrics, and wait to lose consciousness. That night, I fell asleep curled up in a pathetic ball, wishing that when I woke up, my life would be different, anything but this. Unfortunately, my wish would come true. When I awoke, I waited a few minutes before sighing defeat, since nothing had seemed to change. I was hoping that my dad might have been there, waiting to apologize, or that my mom would come to take me away from this place. I looked around my room, hoping to see evidence that I fell into an alternate timeline. Shockingly, something was different. My bookshelf was missing. All of its contents were on the floor. I got busy constructing the conversation I needed to have with my dad. How could I ask about something so strange, especially after our fight last night? After taking a while to steel myself, I ventured downstairs. Dad was brewing tea again, rubbing his forehead with his right hand and leaning on the counter with the other. He heard me come into the kitchen. "Oh, Andrew, you're up early." His voice didn't seem angry anymore. Then I soaked up the scene in front of me. My dad was in his brown housecoat still. The orange sunrise filled the kitchen as I counted the staggering number of mushrooms littering the table and counter space. I wasn't sure if it was the sun or not, but the stems looked brighter than before. They looked like a fresh cut that's bled through a bandage. "There's more of them?" I caught myself asking the question out loud. Yes, well, we're approaching October, and these seem to be just coming into season. Seems I discovered them at the beginning of their life cycle." "So, you've been picking them?" "More subjects, more research, Andrew." I needed to get away from any topic that had to do with the mushrooms. "Dad, were you in my room last night? My bookshelf's missing, and all my books are on the floor. Is everything okay?" He looked away from me and started to pour hot water into his mug. From the back, I noticed how much thinner my dad was now. His shoulders seemed bonier than before, almost like horns protruding from his housecoat. "Yes, everything is fine. I was drinking last night. I made a breakthrough that was worth celebrating." "Yeah, but why'd you need my... wait, what? You were drinking? I thought you said everything was fine." This was the first time my dad had admitted to drinking since my mom left. Yet he was acting like it was no big deal. Either he really just didn't care anymore, or he was lying to cover up something else that was somehow worse. He turned and locked eyes with me. "Yes, Andrew, everything is fine. Better than fine, actually. My life has never been better." He brought his mug up to his lips and took 3 large gulps, audibly exhaling in relief after quenching his thirst. "It appears that the greatest crop is yet to come." He smiled weakly, with empty eyes, and turned towards his office. The door closed sternly behind him, and I remained. My hands were balled up into fists, wishing I had knocked some sense into him, or that I could break down that door and beat him completely senseless. When I went to bed, I decided to barricade my door with a chair, leaning it against the doorknob like I'd seen my brother do when we were younger, when Mom and Dad were having a fight. I didn't feel comfortable with the idea that my dad was sneaking into my bedroom in the middle of the night, acting suspicious, hostile, and distant. I just wanted my dad back. I was sick of being on my own. I woke up that night. My head was aching. I was facing the ceiling like I was prone to do, wondering why I wasn't asleep. My arms and legs were sticky with sweat, as if I had just woken up from a nightmare. A familiar groan from wooden floorboards halted my train of thought and directed my attention to the doorway. It was dark, but the moonlight from outside illuminated my room to the cusp of the hallway. The chair I had been using as a blockade wasn't there. My door was open. I instinctively gripped my bedsheets as I heard my dad's voice from the darkness ahead.
Why, Andrew?
Dad, what are you doing up?
Why, Andrew? Why are you being so difficult?
Difficult? Dad, I'm sorry about everything lately, about our fight, but what's going on?
Andrew.
He seemed to growl, and my body tensed up even more. Dad? I whispered quietly.
Andrew, Andrew, Andrew,
he called out, louder and louder. It sounded like he was trying to use my name to clear out the back of his throat. Dad, stop, please. What's going on with you? You've been acting so weird ever since you found those stupid mushrooms. I finally croaked.
Found them. I didn't find them, Andrew. They found me.
The way he said it made my spine tingle. Them. I wanted to keep asking what he meant, but all I could do was stare at the shadow in my doorway, frozen like a deer caught in headlights.
They told me that you've been difficult, that you aren't listening when they speak to you, when they whisper in your ear.
He hissed as he spoke. Tears welled up in my eyes as I felt pressure begin to loom inside my skull.
They've taught me things, Andrew. They've helped me become happy again. And in exchange, I'm helping them.
Dad? My voice wavered. I was unsure if I wanted an answer.
How are you helping them?
Dad? His shadow stood motionless like a statue or tree. He showed no signs of body language as he continued to speak cryptically.
They hunger, Andrew. They need food. They have a very particular diet.
God, Dad, what do you mean? What have you been doing?
Andrew, they can help you too. They know how lonely you've been. You won't be alone if you just accept them.
He was nearly giggling as he took a step forward.
They're already inside of you. Soon, you'll be like me.
Another step forward.
Just listen to them.
He was practically shambling as he twitched his way into my room. The moonlight washed over his torso, leaving his face obscured in the dark. His arms barely seemed to have any weight to them. They dangled without purpose. His body was covered in deep, bleeding gashes, as though he'd been relentlessly digging into himself the way a farmer would work the land, plowing his flesh apart, sowing seeds of something sinister, and irrigating it with his own lifeblood.
Their bodies contain something similar to mycelia, which responds well to organic life. The fungus we see is merely their way of reproducing.
His sentence droned and filled the entire room.
They haven't been able to propagate properly. However, we lacked the appropriate environment.
His voice melted as it crept into my ear canals, burrowing into my eardrums. I stuck my fingers inside, as if I could scrape the words out. I pressed my palms to the sides of my head, but they kept coming.
He was wrong about the decay, you see. We prefer the confines of a vessel that's still warm.
The one voice became many.
Still operational.
Even with my hands nearly crushing my skull, the words still wormed their way into me. His voice had lost its previous inflection,
as though it had become uninhabited. No, there was something there, only it wasn't a human behind the words anymore. He stopped at the foot of my bed, directly in front of the window. I could see everything now. His face was incredibly gaunt, cheeks sunken in, and it became apparent that his voice wasn't coming from his mouth at all. Its mouth. The pale thing was horribly disfigured. Several grotesque mushrooms were growing out from its gaping maw, curling up over cracked lips. Smaller fungi crept out from behind its tear ducts, and its eye sockets looked hollow in the dark. White stalks sprouted from the wounds in its arms, chest, and shoulders, like a stump that had been repurposed by other organisms. It started to scream as it continued to speak without moving its unhinged jaw, as it continued to speak directly inside my brain.
You've resisted us, Andrew. Accept us.
It hissed again. I can't, I whimpered, my eyes closed, my palms still squeezing my head.
You will. The greatest crop is yet to come.
The crop. It wasn't more mushrooms.
The greatest crop is yet to come.
As I cried, I felt something slithering around inside my head. Panicking as I felt my under eye begin to twitch. I touched the wet space beside my nose, only to feel firm, engorged veins. My fingers shook in front of my face. As I pulled them away, I could see that instead of tears, there was a dark liquid. Blood.
The greatest crop is yet to come.
The pressure in my face released at last, and I heard an audible pop. Suddenly, my vision was obscured, blurred by white stalks and shiny violet caps.
The greatest crop is yet to come.
The crop was me. Then it was silent. The voices ceased, and my head was quiet. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see nothing but mushrooms again, and looked straight at the foot of my bed. Nothing. I could see. I was still drenched in sweat. However, now I was alone. My door was shut, and my chair was again leaned up under the handle like before. I stayed up to see the sunrise before venturing through the house. It was a dream. It must have been. It had to be. I hated that things had gotten to a point where something that horrific had to be questioned. The next few nights that followed, I'd made sure I closed my door and blocked it the same as before. Sometimes I'd wait up to see what would happen, and each night around midnight, without fail, my door handle would turn, shake, then stop. A few minutes after that, heavy footsteps would fade down the hall from my room, presumably down the stairs, and all the way back into the study. Once, out of unbridled curiosity, I followed the footsteps after I heard them go down the stairs. I wasn't satisfied with the conversation my dad and I had, so I was hoping to at least catch him with a bottle in his hand or something. Anything that would prove that he was telling the truth and confirm that I didn't have something else to worry about. I had no such relief. As I got to the bottom of the stairs, I felt a cold wind lick the soles of my feet. The front door was hanging wide open. The dark of night loomed outside. Bluish blackness crept in with the brisk air, as I stared out into the trees across the road from our driveway. My dad was gone. The house was dark and empty. As I stood there, scratching one foot with the other, I grew anxious. I was unnerved, thinking that the best explanation I had for this was that my dad was drinking again, attempting to sneak into my room, only to ransack the place while I slept, and then stroll out in the middle of the night without even closing the door. It's possible, sure, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was behind it. The fact that I couldn't come up with anything else transformed my anxiety into terror. What could be so horrible he would lie about drinking again? That would keep him up at all hours of the night. My nightmare came to mind as I went to shut the door. As I leaned into it, a breeze slipped through the gap like a whisper in the wind. It sounded like something said my name, calling me. I guess I could come up with something after all. That following weekend was when everything would come to a head. It was the weekend again, and my dad was leaving town for a conference. I walked around the car to the driver's side to say goodbye. My dad was checking his bag. As I circled around the front of his car, I noticed a dent in the hood and a crack in his headlight. Something dark crept out from the seam of the plastic, a dark color I'd seen a lot lately. "Hey, Dad, did you hit something? Your light's smashed up," I asked innocently, trying to sound naive. He stopped digging in his bag and looked straight up, as though he remembered something. Invisible gears turned in his head before he fumbled an explanation to me. "Oh, that. I accidentally got too close to a barrier at the store. I've been meaning to get that fixed." He raised an eyebrow at me, sizing up my expression, seeing if I believed him or not. "Huh, should get that looked at," I remarked coolly. His face relaxed as he agreed. Then he pulled away to drive down the gravel road. I didn't believe him, and I was going to find out what he's been hiding. Once the hum of his car was in the distance, I ran inside and locked all the doors. Anything to buy myself some extra time in case he came back. I was about to start pacing and brainstorming. I half expected that I'd need to stealthily break into his office somehow. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. My paranoia grew as I opened the heavy door for the first time in weeks. Worried that he installed an alarm somehow, or that I'd find something much worse than sliced mushrooms. It opened with ease and without any fanfare. The room was nothing like the last time I saw it. Somehow, it looked even stranger. It was pristine. I think he'd even vacuumed. Strangest of all, there wasn't a mushroom in sight. Not one. I searched each and every cabinet and cupboard in that room, trying to find anything at all. Yet all I found were ordinary supplies, books, stationary science equipment, everything you'd expect from a researcher. But I knew that he wouldn't have gotten rid of all those mushrooms. There was no way. After all, more species, more research. I searched the entire house and turned up nothing. For a while I was worried that I had somehow imagined it all, that I was unaware my brain was concocting this horrific fantasy, trying to make up some excuse for my dad's behavior, avoiding the conclusion that I've been the one causing problems, that he just simply didn't love me anymore. Before I called it quits, something occurred to me, something that reinforced my resolve one last time, affirming that I wasn't ready to give up on my instincts. I hadn't checked the basement. I've only gone to that basement a handful of times in my life. It had to have been years since I set foot down there. I've never seen my dad spend time there either. That said,
I wasted no time stepping down the decrepit wooden steps into the dark cellar, as if worried I'd catch the evidence scrambling out the tiny windows. It was even darker than normal, actually pitch black. Scanning around the room revealed no tiny windows at all, but I knew I hadn't imagined those. It took some time as I swung my arms around in the air before I finally grabbed a hold of the drawstring, giving it a firm tug. The single light bulb hanging from the wooden beams came to life and dimly illuminated the expansive subterranean den. It quickly became clear why it was so much darker than I remembered. The windows were boarded up and covered, planks of wood nailed directly into the window frames and black tape bridging the gaps between them. I would have spent more time speculating on why my dad would have gone to these lengths, but I noticed a looming object to my right. My mom's old armoire sat against the back wall. My dad brought it down here a few weeks after she left. Only now, it was sealed with a padlock and chains. As I approached, I prayed that my dad was still enough of my dad to leave the key in a predictable spot. As my hands slid around the entirety of the frame, I could smell my mom's old perfume, soaked in the grain of the wood. Just as memories of her came flowing into my mind, my finger caught something sharp along the top of the cabinet. With a swift rip, I had a small, silver key between my fingertips. I nearly chuckled, knowing that some things about my dad hadn't changed, but it got caught in my throat as I eyed up the looming container. The key unlocked the padlock with ease, and the chains dropped to the floor. As I swung open the doors, expecting bags of mushrooms to tumble out, I was confronted with even more horrible questions. What used to house my mom's clothing and personal effects was now filled with knives, bear traps, a hammer, rope, a jerry can, and a shotgun. My father was not a hunter. Worse yet, most of it was clearly used. A mixture of dirt and blood caked some of the tools, and rounds were missing from an open box of ammunition. Red casings tucked neatly together, and a tin with small, round pellets. Buckshot. Worry set in, deeper and more intense than ever before. I wasn't sure what I thought I'd find down there, but it would never have been this. While attempting to lock up the cabinet in the same way I found it, I remembered that something else was missing down here. Something aside from the windows. The crawl space. Normally, there was a small, white door fitted in the wall furthest from the stairwell. It separated the basement from the deepest chamber in the house, just barely big enough for a person to crawl through, though I couldn't think of any reason someone would go in there voluntarily. In the dim light, I squinted to try and make out the entrance, just in case I might have missed it. Even after my eyes adjusted to the light, I couldn't find the white, rectangular doorway anywhere. What I found instead was an empty bookshelf, alone, sitting across from the stairs. My bookshelf. I didn't have to move it to know why it was there. Its wooden feet scraped along the concrete as I pushed it out of the way, revealing the familiar, latched white door. Before I could even open it, I noticed dozens of small, white tendrils creeping out from underneath. While there was no mystery as to what I'd find under there, I was still shocked when I finally saw it. There must have been hundreds of those disgusting mushrooms packed in there. Some even looked as though they were trying to put down roots, but the packed dirt was too hard. They wanted something soft to sink into. I couldn't see much else in there. Some box-like objects were submerged in the mushroom heap. I didn't even try to dig them out, in case my dad would notice even one specimen out of place. Instead, I stepped back and grappled with reality. I ran my fingers through my hair, scraping my scalp in a sad attempt to comfort myself, as I tried to understand what it was all leading to. It was clear that the lying and secrecy had gotten out of hand. I just didn't know by how much. Who would I need to talk to about this? My brother, Child Protective Services, the police. Regardless, one thing was certain. I needed to confront my dad. But I had to know everything if I wanted to catch him in another lie. I needed proof so that someone would believe me. I looked at one of the boarded-up windows and noticed that a bit of sunlight peeking through was starting to ember. I realized where I needed to go once I saw that I was losing daylight. I had to go back to where it all began. It took a bit longer on my bike, but I eventually came to the spots my dad and I hiked together almost a month before. It's insane to think it had been going on for so long. The woods looked less inviting at dusk, but with my flashlight in hand, I ventured along the same path to the best of my memory. The landmarks definitely looked different without the sun breaking through the trees, but I could still recognize the routes I walked over on that hot summer day. With my hurried pace, it wasn't long before I came to the clearing. My nose alerted me that I had arrived before I could even see it. What had once smelled almost sweet, like dead roses, now reeked of death. Even without the heat of the sun, the place stunk of putrid rot. My flashlight cut through the shadows, creating a spotlight on the mossy patch. My knees went weak, and my vision went blurry. I couldn't see the doe anymore. I couldn't see her, because there was a pile of corpses on top of her. My guts spun in circles as a gust of wind blew the rancid stench of decaying flesh into my nostrils. Dozens of animal bodies were haphazardly tossed on top of each other. The sound of insects and flies hummed, their buzzing creating a twisted musical score to the scene in front of me. Deer, rabbits, squirrels, a raccoon or two, cats, a dog. Their fur was matted with blood. Limbs were sloppily lopped off at different increments. Some were missing half of their bodies. While a few looked crushed, most had stab wounds, slash marks, and bullet holes decorating their bodies. I could see them all, because from each wound grew a white stalk, capped with a glimmering, iridescent, violet-blue head. Mushrooms of varying sizes bloomed from the mangled bodies, their sizes seemingly proportionate to the creature and wound inflicted, as though it wasn't just the blood and flesh they were feeding on, but rather the amount of pain and suffering that had been inflicted, siphonizing out the anguished soul in order to feed a primordial beast. My dad's ominous prediction echoed as my legs finally gave out.
The greatest crop is yet to come.
Now his words sounded more like a promise as I finally bore witness to the fruits of his labor, his research.
The greatest crop is yet to come.
My head snapped side to side as I sat on the hard earth, frantically searching the woods around me. I realized now that I wasn't imagining it the first time. I wasn't just remembering what my dad said. I was hearing him say it right now.
The greatest crop is yet to come.
The voices didn't seem to come from any one direction. I stuck my fingers in my ears, hoping that some bug or air pressure was causing me to hear things.
The greatest crop is yet to come, Andrew.
The thrumming harmonies coursed through my body. Nothing helped. It was coming from inside my head. I found myself up and running before I managed another thought. I could tell I wasn't dreaming this time by the pain in my feet, my labored breaths, and the breeze against the hair on my neck. The voices in my head faded the further away I got. It encouraged me, reassuring me that I needed to get away from that place as quickly as possible. Away from those things.
My dad returned the next day. I sat on the stairs inside, waiting for him to come in so I could attempt to greet him, give him the chance to explain himself before I went to find help. He was looking malnourished and exhausted, almost like a ghost, but otherwise fine. Yet, the look he gave me when our eyes met was somehow more haunting than a face disfigured by mushrooms. If anything, it looked like he couldn't stand my face. He pursed his lips and, without saying a word, walked directly to his office and shut the door. A week went by, and I never saw my dad. His office door stayed closed, and I didn't dare to open it. This whole time I was teetering on the line, wondering if I should call the police. But the thought of sending my dad to jail made me nauseous. Where would I go? It felt like my mom left me for a reason, and my brother wouldn't know what to do with me. Even worse, what would I do if I called the police and they found nothing? What would my dad think of me? I'd look like I've lost my mind. Those thoughts gnawed at me, paralyzing me into inaction. I waited for a chance to speak with my dad, or, at the very least, any valid opportunity for me to call the police. It was the second day of October, and I laid awake in bed once more. Sleep became a game of chance, as I kept worrying that my dad knew what I had been up to, that he would try and break through my makeshift barricade every night. Though he hadn't tried to get in since the day he returned. I listened closely that night, on October 2nd, for the door handle, footsteps, speaking, anything. Then it came. A distant thump, too far to make out any details. It continued, pulling me upright in my bed. I fidgeted for a minute, debating whether or not I should investigate, considering how little good it had done me so far. But the sound was drawing me in. I had prepared for this after that first night, just in case. I grabbed a wooden baseball bat that I stowed underneath my bed and moved to disassemble my barricade. The rhythmic thud was louder in the hallway, but still seemed distant. I made my way downstairs, and I could feel the thump resonating within the floorboards under my bare feet. It was almost like a knock, but more hollow and without purpose. It had to be in the basement. From the top of the stairs, I could see that the lonely light bulb was on, and the thumping was more distinct now. It sounded like something hard hitting wood. I held the bat close as I turned the corner. My dad was facing away from me in the middle of the room. He was slamming his forehead into the wooden support beam. It agitated me enough to shout. "Dad!" I announced my presence sternly. He didn't acknowledge me, so I moved to stop him. "Dad, stop this, please," I quietly begged as I reached for his arm. As soon as I made contact, he stopped right before his skull connected with the wood once more.
"Andy, please go away,"
he whimpered. "Dad, stop doing this to yourself. You need to get some serious help." I sidestepped
to look him in the eye, but I wasn't sure where to look. His forehead had been split open, and blood poured down his face. It pooled in his eyes, and his irises were almost black against the red backdrop. Streaks of pale skin peeked out from beneath the red below his eyes. He'd been crying.
"No,"
he said, more matter-of-factly.
"You need help, Andrew."
What?
I wanted you to stop meddling and interfering. Why did you do this? You're always getting in the way, making things more difficult.
He shook his head. Dad, I'm not. I haven't done anything wrong. I pleaded to whatever rationality he had left.
Don't lie.
He howled, and he gripped the wooden beam and slammed his other fist into it.
I know you've been snooping around, that you went back to the Grove. Someone could have seen you. Someone could have followed you. Then where would I be? Huh, Andy? Look what you're doing to your poor old dad.
He spat blood as he spoke, and was on the verge of crying once more. I don't get it, Dad. Why does it matter so much? It's just some stupid mushroom. I'm your son, damn it. My voice cracked as I shouted. The fear, sorrow, and loneliness I'd been building up was finally leaking out. He turned what was left of his face to me, and his hot eyes began to stare right through me.
We are not some mushroom, Andrew.
His voice changed again, just like that night. The sobs he tried to choke back were gone. Instead, he just stared at me. I didn't say that... Wait, how did you know that I went to the Grove, Dad? The bloody, battered face tilted to the side. Dad, answer me.
We were there, Andrew. We know you're trying to get rid of us. We thought you would help us, but you want us gone.
His voice was stripped again of all humanity, like talking to something that had never been human before. I wanted to plead with him to stop all of this, because I felt like I knew how it would end, like my nightmare was coming true. What the hell, Dad? I don't want...
We wanted to help you, to make you understand things most beings couldn't begin to comprehend. To see the universe through us. We see now that you're not suitable. You're not the one we thought you were. You've become dangerous.
The blackened coals in his eye sockets shivered and slowly slid to the side. I followed their lead. The armoire was open. On the floor in front of it was an older suitcase, but what leaned against it put a stone in my throat. The shotgun. I slowly rotated my head back to my dad, as if to look invisible to a predator. He was still staring at the gun, as if assessing its necessity, or judging the amount of time it would take to grab it.
We don't need you anymore.
His face seemed to strain for a moment. Then, from beneath the blood-stained whites of his eyes, it looked as though a small, white sprout was creeping up from behind the eyelid, streaked with bright red blood. It wiggled as though it just took its first breath. I ran for the stairs. My dad wants to kill me. I turned down the hall and threw open the front door. No, that thing isn't my dad. I picked up my bike as I kept running and threw my leg over, pedaling for dear life in my bare feet. That thing was going to kill me. The thought flooded my head, pumping even more adrenaline into my body. My lungs felt like they were going to explode as I biked down the road.
I kept looking back over my shoulder and throughout the woods, as though it could appear at any second, as though it were everywhere. To avoid getting caught, I veered off onto a nearby trail. While it would take me slightly longer to get to my nearest neighbor, I wouldn't be spotted if it came driving down the road after me. If there was ever a time to get help, that was it. Eventually, I made it to my nearest neighbor. I barely explained what had happened before she called the police, gnawing on her thumb while answering their questions over the phone. She repeatedly asked how soon they could be there. I guess the mention of a crazed man with a gun would make anyone impatient. 15 minutes passed as I continued to peek out at the street from behind the blinds, ignoring the cup of hot chocolate she had made for me as some attempt at comfort. I eventually noticed the distant glow of flashing lights from further down the road. Soon, red and blue lights flew past us. "God, finally," she sighed. I didn't know what to say, but I shared the sentiment. The hot cocoa went cold as we sat in silence, waiting until the police finally came to her front door. She answered, peeking through with the lock still latched, clearly unused to visitors. A voice mentioned my name, and she turned to look at me. Her thumb was still anxiously caught between her teeth while she signaled me to come closer. I don't remember much about the policeman, other than the thick-rimmed glasses on his face and the khakis he wore. It all made my stomach turn. The deputy badge pinned to his chest calmed my nerves slightly. "We couldn't find anyone in the house, and the car was gone. However, we saw the mess down in the basement. I think you should stay here for the night, if that's all right with you, ma'am." "What about everything else? Like the guns or the mushrooms?" I urged. "Mushrooms? No mushrooms. The gun is—" He paused while looking back behind him at another officer, obviously wondering if he should share the information with a kid. "The gun is missing. But don't worry, we'll be on high alert, and an officer will be stationed outside all night." He leaned back and motioned to his subordinates to reassure me. I was in a daze as he continued to speak about the steps they were taking. I couldn't get over the fact that my dad, that thing, was out there somewhere. I felt a strong breeze blow in through the door, and the smell of smoke lit up my nostrils. Yet nobody else seemed to notice. I leaned out the doorway to look towards my home. No fire. The deputy did a double take, slightly confused, then raised his nose slightly. He must have noticed it too now. He reassured me and my neighbor that we were in good hands one last time before walking down the steps. I watched him throw the car in drive and speed back up the road towards my house. I closed the door, and my neighbor guided me to the couch with another cup of hot chocolate. This one was new and actually hot. She explained that she lived alone and didn't see people often, that she'd almost forgotten how she's meant to comfort someone. I almost wanted to tell her that it was fine, that I was used to it now. She finished off by introducing herself as Lydia, which only reinforced the truthfulness behind her statement. I ended up being the one to console her, saying that the police would probably find him soon. She nodded and said goodnight before leaving me on the couch with some extra pillows and blankets. My eyes were closed, yet I didn't fall asleep that night. I laid awake until the sun's first light broke through the trees, and I left before Lydia woke up. The officer left in front of Lydia's house had been sleeping. I only knew this because he startled awake when I knocked on his window. He rolled it down in a hurry and asked what I was doing outside. I explained that I couldn't stop thinking about the smell of smoke,
that if it wasn't my house that was burning, then there was only one place it could have been. It tried to get me to explain how to get to the grove, but I said it would be easier to just show him. A part of me needed to see it, too. He radioed our destination to his team before we sped off. It wasn't long before the grove was in sight, and the smell of fresh embers filled the air. There was an undertone of death in the smoke, and all I could imagine was the mountain of corpses that were present last time. I plugged my nose as I slipped between two trees. The officer followed suit. For better or worse, my dad wasn't there. In fact, there was almost nothing there. No mushrooms, no corpses, and no moss.
Dear God,
the cop let out under his breath. There was a black stain on the earth, where a raging yet controlled fire consumed everything in its wake. It wasn't hot, but the ground felt warm beneath me. I walked closer and could see hundreds of fragments of charred bone, too small to associate with any specific animal.
Hey kid, don't touch anything. I'm gonna sweep the perimeter real quick and radio the guys,
he began, walking to the edge of the grove, tripping over roots and foliage in an understated panic.
Seriously, and stay where I can see you.
As he walked along the edge, I continued examining the scene. Some of the remains looked cracked or snapped, as though they'd been burned and then pulverized. With a nearby stick, I prodded through the ash and bone. I'm not sure if it was just morbid curiosity or an actual attempt at discovering anything of note. As I neared the center of the black hole, I began poking into the ash. It wasn't long before I hit something solid. It wasn't hard like bone. It was sort of soft. Soft and hollow. With the side of my foot, I cleared off some of the ash that covered the object, surfacing something that looked like black skin. Dusting off slightly more with my hands, I noticed a pair of metal buckles along the side. It was a suitcase. It was burnt, but I recognized it as the same suitcase my dad had in the basement. My hands shook as I struggled to unlatch it and open the lid. I stared for what felt like an eternity as I knelt before it, unable to grasp what lay before me.
Hey, kid, what'd I say?
Wait, what is that?
What'd you find?
The officer called out from the tree line, still completing his round. It was a suitcase full of clothes. Women's clothes. Mom's clothes. As though I was reliving the moment, I remembered it as the suitcase she packed the night she was going to leave us. To leave and move to Maine. The suitcase I walked in on her packing, while my dad was drunkenly smashing our dinner plates downstairs. On top of the teal blouse, in a neat and tidy pile, was a bottle of perfume, a stack of stationery envelopes and stamps, an orange sunset with an ocean scene. I don't know if I was already crying, but that was the moment I choked up and became desperate for more, hoping there was something left of her in the suitcase. A letter, a note, a grocery list, anything. As I began feverishly shuffling things around, my insides sank deeper and deeper as I finally reached the bottom of the bag. Underneath my mom's clothes were extra shirts and pants, too small for an adult. They looked terribly familiar. They were mine and my brother's old clothes. They were folded neatly alongside a couple books, CDs, and my small, stuffed gorilla I lost years ago. I always took him on road trips when I was little. My heart began to race
as I started piecing it together, so fast I thought it would burst. I couldn't stop myself from sobbing. I was gasping for air. I grasped at the handle and pulled the burnt suitcase closer to me. I brought it onto my lap and against my chest, clinging to it, as if it were some replacement for a mother's embrace. I was trying to wring out whatever bits of parental love was still left in it. When I opened my tear-blurred eyes, my grip on the bag loosened.
Kid, can't you hear? I was saying.
The cop's sentence faded as he saw what I had uncovered. Holy shit. He took to the radio immediately, calling out for anyone that was listening. I dropped the bag and doubled over in grief and sickness. I couldn't see anything as I grasped at the soft, burnt earth below me. I began heaving, though I'm not sure if it was because I didn't have any tears left in me, or because I was finally going to throw up. A blackened skeleton with a large crack in its skull lay curled up in a small hole. A golden band, which survived multiple firestorms, still adorned its bloody finger. The hole was deep enough that I could tell it had been buried there long before the suitcase. In the center of a solitary grove, untouched by sunlight and away from prying eyes. Right below where the mushrooms had first taken root.